So good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. I want to welcome you today to the Civic Scientist Lecture titled America at a Tipping Point, Science and Technology Opportunities for the Biden Administration. Thank you all for joining us online. My name is Neil Lane. I'm Senior Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. I have the great pleasure to moderate today's event. Joining our speakers, two very famous engineers, Norman Augustine and John Hennessy, whom I will introduce in a few moments. First, I want to thank the supporters that make our policy research and this event possible. The Baker Institute Science and Technology Policy Civic Scientist Series, including today's event, is made possible by a generous gift from Winifred and Benjamin Chang, as well as support from the Weiss School of Natural Sciences and the Brown School of Engineering at Rice University. In addition, we're very grateful to the Kavli Foundation and the National Science Foundation for their support of outreach activities related to the report and our panelists that our panelists will discuss today. Finally, I want to acknowledge and thank the Baker Institute staff for their help in organizing events such as this one. Today, our speakers are going to discuss some issues that are the focus of a report titled The Perils of Complacency, America at a Tipping Point in Science and Engineering, which was released this past September and was a joint project of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. The report was written by a very distinguished study committee, which included John Hennessy, and Norm Augustine and I had the privilege of co-chairing the committee. The report describes the many challenges facing American science, engineering, technology, and innovation in the 21st century, and our panelists will discuss many of these challenges. A link to the report can be found in the chat window. The report was just going to the printer when the pandemic broke out, but it is our view that its recommendations remain valid, and if anything, COVID-19 has underscored the importance of the issues and the urgent need for a national response. The Biden administration has indicated that science and technology will be a high priority, and there appears to be bipartisan support in Congress for taking action. Today, we're privileged to have two speakers who need no introduction, but they'll get a little one anyway. They definitely know a great deal about the topics we're discussing today, so I will be brief. Our first speaker is Mr. Norm Augustine, retired CEO and chairman of Lockheed Martin and former Undersecretary of the Army, who in addition to co-chairing the study committee that developed the Perils of Complacency report, was the principal author and shaker and mover, I would say, of the National Academy's influential report, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, that raised alarm bells over a decade ago. Norm has been awarded the National Medal of Technology among many recognitions. He's advised many presidents, including 16 years serving on the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology for Presidents Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. I was only involved for 2 years. I can only imagine 16 years. Thank you, Norm, for that service to the country. Following Norm will be Dr. John Hennessy, former president of Stanford University and current chairman of the board of Alphabet, the parent company of Google. John has been front and center dealing with all the challenges that academic institutions and technology ventures face in today's competitive environment. John is a Turing Award winner for developing a technology that is likely inside all our smartphones, laptops, iPads, and computers of all sizes and descriptions. He has been called the godfather of Silicon Valley. After our speakers' presentations, we'll have time for discussion, so please use the Q&A box to ask the questions. Mr. Augustine will lead off and tell us about the report. Norm, the floor or the Zoom camera and mic are yours.
Well, thank you, Neil. And it's always a pleasure to be with you and John. And I think our topic today is one that's of major importance to our country. It probably seems a little incongruous to be raising concerns about the state of American science and technology on the heels of the last year and a half, where starting without much warning, the scientific community developed a vaccine against the pandemic to control the pandemic. And the engineering community helped produce and helped to see to the distribution of what last count was around 150 million shots that were administered. But as you pointed out, maybe the impact of that is to show the importance of science. And a second thing I think it points out is that to a large degree, we've been living off of past investments in science and technology, particularly given the speed at which they move. And I'd like to touch a little bit on that as I introduce the report that you mentioned about the perils. Our report is fairly straightforward. It really, I think it can be summarized with three principal thrusts. The first of which is that America's well-being, whether it be in healthcare, Social Security, infrastructure, national defense, and so on, really depends on having a strong economy that can pay the bills to support all of these things that we hold dear. The second is that America's economy is in turn founded to a very large degree on science and technology. There have been a number of studies, two of which were the foundation of Nobel Prizes, that have shown that up to 85% of the growth in America's GDP, our economy, could be attributed to advancements in just two fields, namely science and technology. And those studies also showed that about 2/3 of the growth of the nation's productivity is attributable to those same two fields. And thirdly, that America is in the process of losing its lead in those fields to the People's Republic of China. And with those, let me run through some charts. If I could have the first one. And the next one, please. This is a chart showing the number of first university degrees offered, baccalaureate degrees in essence, by universities in China, red, or in the United States, blue. And as you can see, in the last 2 decades, China has rapidly accelerated and now is graduating about twice as many first degree science and engineering awards each year. And this probably should be no surprise. China, after all, has 4 times our population. But that's the point, that business as usual, where we just count on having more of everything, isn't going to work anymore. We're likely to be outnumbered in terms of scientists, engineers, our military, and so on. And if we are to be competitive in these various fields, it's going to depend to a very great extent on our ability to be innovative, creative, to be efficient in taking new knowledge that's generated and applying it to important issues. And so many of the important issues we face today in our country and in the world, but in our country, really have their foundation to their solution in science and technology. And you can think of providing clean energy, rebuilding the infrastructure, building a strong economy, creating jobs, go down the line. If I could have the next chart, please. China has recognized this. Here's a quote. I'll let you all read it. And this too should be no surprise coming from China, where the leadership of the country in the last half century has been heavily populated with engineers and scientists. And the importance of those fields is not likely to be lost. Next chart. This is the cover of the first study that Neil referred to, Restoring the Foundation, which was put together by a group of 25 of us. John was one of those members, of course. And we looked at the status and the trends in the health of America's science and engineering, and particularly with a focus on basic research. And we found many disquieting signals. And given those, we took another look 5 years later, next chart, and produced a report called The Perils of Complacency. And it was at this point that the growth of China was really beginning to have an impact in the fields that we were addressing. The people who served on those two committees, next chart, is shown here. You probably recommend some of the folks. It includes presidents of universities, both public and private, former presidential appointees, several Nobel laureates, CEOs of some fairly large companies, but a fairly balanced group of people that address this issue. And I'm happy to say that our report was unanimously supported along with its findings and recommendations. The next chart. Certainly one of the two greatest drivers, we need to back up one. Thank you. Certainly one of the two greatest drivers of advancement in science and technology has to be the talent that's devoted to it. And let me emphasize that should be a well-educated, highly motivated talent. And it's hard to measure talent, but one indicator is how is our educational system doing in producing future scientists and engineers, or in preparing them? This chart applies to 15-year-olds in a large number of countries and areas, and it is a portrayal of the results of the PISA tests that are probably the most highly regarded international test of reading, science, and math. And the scores shown here, the little dots for various countries, is the combined score in those three fields. And the large black arrow and the little blue dot is the United States. And as you can see, we're a long way from the top. In fact, we're about 25th out of 29 countries. And those countries that are shown here are all developed countries. Next chart, please. This reflects itself then years later in doctoral degrees in engineering and the natural sciences. And one can ask the question, how have we been able to be so competitive in years past with a primary and secondary school system that is frankly very non-competitive by world standards on average? And the answer has been that we've been able to attract to our country many talented people who were foreign born, came to our great research universities, studied there, decided to remain here, build families here, and contribute to America's science and technology base. And if you look at the number of doctoral degrees in engineering and the natural sciences, one finds that almost 40%. Today it is very close to 40%. It is 40% of the graduates with that particular degree from U.S. universities are indeed foreign born. Increasingly, they're returning home, particularly those from China. Next chart, please. This points out how important the foreign-born talent is to the STEM workforce overall. The blue line shows the foreign-born as a share of the STEM force as a whole, and the red line includes the health and social science workforce. And as you can see, it's a substantial part of the STEM workforce and growing, where in 2020, it's well above what's shown here. The final data are not in. The next chart. There's another asset that's of extreme importance, of one of the two that we cite. Of course, there are many assets, but these two stand out. And that, of course, is financial resources to support the talent that we attract or generate in our country. The yellow line shows the fraction of R&D performed in the United States that was funded by the federal government. The red line is that fraction funded by business. For many years, the government funded about 2/3 of the nation's R&D. That today has dropped to about 1/3 over the last half century. Industry has picked up much of the slack, or some of the slack, from its earlier share of around 1/3, today about 2/3. But there's a problem behind these curves. That is that industry is primarily focused on development, not on research, particularly not on basic research. And that makes government the primary candidate to fund fundamental research that is so important and on which most everything else is built in the fields of technology. The red curve displays a trend that seems to be continuing, and the drop in it or behind it of industry's contribution to basic research is seen in the demise or decline of the great industrial research laboratories of decades past. And Bell Labs being the canonical case, the home of the laser and the transistor, home of 9 Nobel laureates, today is owned by a company in Finland. Next chart, please. Turning from input to output, this is just one indicator of what's happening in the business world. This is the number of companies in the global Fortune 500, the blue from the United States, red from China. And as you can see, the US portion is declining, Chinese portion is increasing and is now past the US portion. This is an imperfect measure, obviously, but certainly the trends are rather astonishing. I might just say in passing, my first trip to China was in 1978. And I traveled thousands of miles around China. I saw a few handfuls of cars. Everyone I saw, adult, was wearing a Mao suit. Since then, I've been back every 5 or 6 years. And what they've accomplished is truly remarkable. And while I think many of us don't endorse the way they accomplish some of those things, the results are there to be seen. Next chart. Another measure is the number of economies or countries, if you will, whose top merchandising trade partner is either China or the United States. And the trend looks familiar in this regard. Indeed, many other countries are now looking to China for partnerships rather than the United States. Next chart, please. This is sort of a report card that was presented in the report, in various parts of the report, of how we're doing in terms of investment in R&D and purchasing power parity, which we think is probably the best measure. We're still in first, but China is rapidly gaining on us. It is expected if we stay on our current paths and China stays on its path, as it's stipulated it will in its 14th five-year plan, we will lose first place in the next few years. In terms of innovation, as measured by the Bloomberg Index, we've fallen from first to 8th in recent years. R&D as a percent of GDP, another important measure, we've dropped from first to 9th. Education, primary and secondary, as you saw before, we're 25th now among the developed nations. Professionals engaged in R&D per capita, we rank 28th. Fraction of the research that our government funds, that a particular government funds, were 29th. And the fraction of initial degrees awarded in engineering, showing the disinterest and lack of preparation of many of our young people in the fields of science and technology, we rank 76. Out of curiosity, I looked up to see who we had edged out, and it was Mozambique, who we just got by. Next chart, please. But there's an elephant in the living room that's going to make whatever action we take very difficult and demand that we be very consistent and reach for the stars. This is a plot of federal R&D as a percent of discretionary spending outlays, and the red bar is all discretionary outlays. Red bar, the blue bar, is non-defense R&D as a percent of non-defense outlays. And rather remarkably, for just under a half century, our spending on R&D as a percent of discretionary outlays has been about 10%. It doesn't seem to change very much. And I think that's without any particular plan. It's just happened that way. If we look at the next chart, though, we meet the elephant. This is a chart of federal revenue, the red line, non-discretionary spending, the various curves as a percentage of GDP, and it is not adjusted for the impact of the COVID budgetary changes because there's still so many of them underway. Having said that, if you look at the colored mountain sides at the bottom, these are expenditures, outlays that are already in place under current law. And as you see, at about 2040, not that far away now, an astonishing thing happens that these non-discretionary expenditures at the bottom equal all the government's revenues. In other words, the white area between the red bar and the top of the orange profile is the discretionary funding of which research and development gets 10%, and it's going to zero. And this should be of great concern to us because in 2042, there will be no money for research, development, highways, national security, education. Other than that, can be achieved through increased taxes, which of course increases interest rates and commitments, or through major cuts in existing programs, and or through substantial increases in taxes. That's the big challenge to implementing the kind of things that I've been talking about. Next chart. The committee has offered a number of recommendations. They include boosting federal research, fundamental research funding by 50%. The bad news is it's 50% is a big number. And on the other hand, the good news is that we only spend 0.1% on basic research now, 2/10 on federal basic research. And so we only need to add 0.1% of the GDP. The budget process, we really don't have a process today. I've spent 10 years in government. Neil has spent time there. We need a rolling 5-year plan, a 2-year funding cycle as a minimum. And astonishingly to people from industry, our government doesn't have a capital budget, doesn't even have one. Rules and regulations everyone is familiar with. We need to grow the talent of our workforce, both foreign born and native born. We have to, as part of that, to transform the quality of our pre-K through 12 education and make it available to all of our citizens. GUI partnership, government, university, industry, very important. This is a case where, in my view, the sum is less, the addition of the whole is less than the sum of the parts. And then finally, our universities, we need to restore the state funding that's been cut and repeal the tax on private institutions, tax endowments that the government has imposed, the gain on their tax endowments. And while that tax is relatively modest and affects only a few of our finest institutions, it's a slippery slope that we're on. Next chart. And now I'll turn to my colleague, John, with this very interesting chart.
Thank you, Norm. That was a wonderful summary of the important insights in the report. What I wanted to focus on was the critical relationship between science and technology investments and industry and the development of products and our leadership in that sector. One of the great strengths of the United States is its strong symbiotic relationship between industries, universities, and research laboratories. And I think that has been a source of ongoing strength for us, and one that is critical to maintain. But it's also a very nuanced relationship. It's not a simple linear progress. We can find examples where research occurs and moves back and forth over time between university work advancing the field, as well as products. A good example of this is the work that was done at Xerox PARC in the 1970s and 80s, one of the great central research laboratories in the US, especially in information technology. The home of both the Xerox Alto, which is the prototype for the modern personal computer, as well as things like the Ethernet, which were invented there. Their work influenced in so many different ways what happened in the computing industry over the next 30 or 40 years. For example, Adobe is a direct spin out from the work that Xerox PARC did on fonts and font design, for example. The Apple Macintosh was directly inspired by Steve Jobs' trip to visit Xerox, but it also had dramatic effects on university research and subsequent activities in industry. So, for example, one of the key things that happened was Xerox PARC donated a set of Altos and Ethernet technology and their early client server technology to a number of universities. They influenced the design of many modern computer systems. Cisco, for example, a Stanford spinout, was created to try to build that technology, take the technology of the Ethernet and the internet, marry them together, and really begin to build what became modern internet technology. Sun Microsystems and Silicon Graphics were also companies that were inspired by these activities and these designs of these systems. So there was an interplay from industrial research laboratory out to industry, but also back to universities that then inspired subsequent spinouts. But this has happened many times. The US government's investment in artificial intelligence has been going on for more than 50 years, and it's a long-term investment in fundamental technologies. And indeed, many of the key things that underlie the modern deep learning revolution came out quite a bit earlier. They came decades ago, where we understood how to do back propagation and how to train a neural network. What we needed was other pieces of technology. In particular, we needed large training sets so we could train a complex neural network to do image recognition, for example. And we needed dramatic breakthroughs in computational capability. Those dramatic breakthroughs came out of other research that was going on that eventually developed companies like NVIDIA with the ability to bring GPUs to the process of training these large neural networks. And the internet and the World Wide Web developed the capability of assembling a large data set, like ImageNet, that was used to train the CNNs and make the real breakthrough there. So all these pieces had to come together to get that. Another example is what's happened in cloud computing. It's fascinating to think about cloud computing. There were these early client server models at Xerox PARC, a company called Apollo, which was a spin out on the East Coast. But there was a famous set of papers in the 1970s out of UCLA on what it took to virtualize a machine. That led to lots of interesting follow-on work. IBM introduced the VM series of machines. And then years later, inside the university, my colleague Mendel Rosenblum began to look at the process of virtualizing and hosting multiple OSs. Today, that company became VMware, and today that technology underlies what we're doing in cloud computing. Without the virtual machine, we couldn't have secure cloud computing. So AWS, Google Cloud, all depend on this technology. This interplay is really crucial. Can I have the next slide, please? Whoops, next slide. I also want to point out that a number of these investments in core research, in basic research, are in fundamentally important technologies which change not only their core industry, but affect other industries. In this case, I've taken information technology. This is again from the same National Academies report. Today, think about the way in which information technology has changed the automobile industry. You buy a car today, it has dozens of microprocessors in it. And as we move towards self-driving cars, which could save hundreds of thousands of lives every year, we'll have more than dozens of computers inside those cars. Healthcare, the transformational effect of information technology, both in our ability to do complex diagnostics, but also with things like electronic medical records. And of course, entertainment, one of the great successes of information technology and computer graphics is the way we do entertainment today. Imagine the old days. I'm old enough to remember claymation, and claymation was the way in which you did animation in the early days. It's amazing how much has that changed with companies like NVIDIA and Pixar. But I want to point out that this is just one strategic area. What the federal government does is invest in core strategic areas. Take materials, for example, a fundamental research area that underlines the semiconductor industry, modern battery technology, energy technologies, building of more efficient engines and more efficient systems, or biology, fundamental work in biology, the Human Genome Project that the US government funded, or work on RNA that underlies the creation of CRISPR and Cas9, which may eventually provide solutions for people with genetic defects. Let's go to the final slide. The final slide here is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but it's tongue-in-cheek because it talks about 10 ways in which we could lose our global competitiveness. And you'll see that we have fallen into the trap in many of these. First of all, as Norm clearly pointed out, underfunding of R&D has been a key factor. Secondly, if you walk through the halls of our research laboratory at Stanford or at Rice, or you walk through one of the companies down in Silicon Valley in the tech industry, whether it be semiconductor or a computer company, you will find that it is chock full of incredibly talented individuals who came from outside our United States. And indeed, if you look at the string of startups that have come out of Stanford, Yahoo, Google, Silicon Graphics, MIPS, we all had people born outside the United States as part of our founding teams. So deterring immigration of talented STEM students is a real problem for the entire industry. We need to have a better integrated, coherent federal funding strategy around what are the important areas in which we should be funding. And we need to fund capital resources to federal facilities so that we can have cutting edge laboratories which really lead the world. Norm mentioned this issue of how you think about long-term funding cycle. It's absolutely crucial. In my work, I had two projects, both of which led to startups. One was the project MIPS, which developed the core concepts in risk technology. And the other was a company called Atheros, which was an early developer of Wi-Fi technology. In both cases, you could not have predicted the outcome of the research when you started the project. So there's a need for longer term funding and for clear opportunities for people to explore in that funding. And so saddling researchers with onerous regulations or with short-term reporting things that hold them to a standard that's inappropriate for research undermines the quality of work. Of course, if we're going to be successful and maintain our leadership, we need to have a strong primary and secondary education system. And we need to have our state universities well supported. The vast majority of people who get education in STEM in the US at the bachelor's level will be educated in a public institution. And the decrease in state investments in public universities has led to a massive increase in the student debt burden and lower graduation rates. We have to think about high risk, high potential research. That is where the federal government plays a unique role. It's something that industry cannot do well and cannot justify. And as Norm mentioned, the fading of our great research laboratories, Bell Labs being the canonical example, shows the importance of the federal government in funding that research. And finally, dealing with this elephant in the room that Norm talked about, the federal budget and the pressure on discretionary funding is going to be crucial. If we fail to do these things, which is unfortunately what has happened so many times when we become complacent, we will no longer lead the world either in research or eventually in our capabilities and our products. Thank you, and I'll turn it back to Neil.
Thank you very much, John. That was a terrific presentation, and Norm as well, and succinctly describing all of the complex issues, or so many of the complex issues that our report addresses. Let me just start. We have lots of questions coming in, but let me just start with one that was provoked from one of Norm's comments about Bell Labs, but also, John, your comment about Xerox PARC. So Bell Labs, AT&T did not gain most of the benefits, at least in terms of economic terms, from the transistor, for example, and the many other developments, nor did TI, Texas Instruments, from the integrated circuit. But Xerox PARC must stand as another kind of singular example of a company that kind of gave away all these externalities that benefited everybody else in the way that you described. Are there companies like that today? I mean, do stockholders go for that? What would you say about externalities and spillovers that benefit others? And of course, right on the tail of that question will be, and what about China? Don't they benefit from all of these externalities? Let's start with John and then Norm.
Well, I think, Neil, there's an interesting observation that's been made both about, at that time, the three great research laboratories in information technology, Xerox PARC, IBM, and Bell Labs. Right. They were all funded by basically what was a semi-monopoly in that core industry. IBM in mainframes, AT&T with telephone service, and Xerox PARC with copiers. I think right today, it would be impossible to do something like that. And you look at the modern research laboratories, whether it's Google Research or Microsoft Research or even today's version of IBM Research, they're much closer to product development, and there's a much more intimate connection to product development. And I think that's something that shareholders obviously force upon things. But I think it's also a reminder that when you invent something that is as universal and as broadly applicable as the transistor, that's going to, lots of people are going to capture value from that particular invention, as would happen with the integrated circuit as well. So I think we need to keep that in mind and ask, where is the best place to do that kind of research?
Thank you. Norm, comment?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with each of John's points. I think that there are three issues that get into this question of the use of basic research and the importance of it. First of all, funding basic research in industry, and I spent most of my career in industry. We used to have a lab that did fairly basic research and eventually had to close it. I won't go into why, but I can if there's time. But in any event, basic research has three features at least that aren't attractive to shareholders. One of them is that it takes a long time to pay off. When I first entered the business world, the average shareholder held their stock 8 years. Today it's 4 months and declining. Secondly, basic research is risky. It often fails. And thirdly, and John alluded to this, that you don't know who will be the beneficiary of the research you perform. And that was part of your question too, that you may have a breakthrough in one area that affects the nation as a whole, or even the world as a whole. And it's important to do that research, but the payer, the funder of the research may not be the beneficiary, nor may be the person performing the research. And so that makes it somewhat unattractive. The bottom line then is that if you're going to do basic research, and if this country is to survive, it's going to have to. If you're going to do basic research, it's going to have to be funded largely by the government. Foundations can help. Industry just can't do it. And it points to one of those things that governments can do, namely those things that benefit society as a whole, that the private sector either can't or won't fund.
So Norm and John, industry reports, when you ask, that they're spending a lot of money on research, including basic research, even at the level the federal government is spending. What is that research? I mean, how is that different from the kind of basic research we're talking about that largely in universities and national labs? Either John, why don't you start if you have a comment on that, and then Norm.
Well, I think the natural thing for industry to do is to lump together research and development. And if you were to look at where that budget gets spent, the lion's share of it gets spent on the development end of it, on actually taking concepts and turning them into products. And that's appropriate, I think, Neil. I mean, when you I look at the cost of what it cost us to do our research project at the university in the 1980s. You know, our total, we probably spent about $4 million over a multi-year period on our research project. To take that out to a company and build its first product, the company needed about 20 million just for the first product, and the company needed about 100 million to get public and become profitable. So there's a large delta there as you go to product development.
Norm?
I think John answered it. I'll be quiet.
Okay, let me ask back to one of the elephants. I mean, that competition with China. Another aspect of that elephant, maybe the trunk or whatever, is trying to establish the right balance between research security, or let's just say security in general, what we openly give to the world in terms of knowledge coming out of our laboratories and our campuses, and how that's used by other countries. Seems to be somewhat a different global environment now. Does that mean, for example, President Reagan's National Security Decision Directive, which is pretty liberal with regard to basic fundamental research, is that still valid? Does it need to be changed? It's obviously a big issue, and it's become a political one. John, you want to comment?
Well, I think it is a core issue. I think the President Reagan's National Security Directive is still the best thing to operate with. But I think, Neil, it's become clear that in some cases, individuals are being sent here with a mission that goes beyond just getting an education, that goes towards the export of technology. And we inside the university are not particularly well equipped to do the kind of deep dive security analysis that would be necessary to separate out the student who's coming here for an education and maybe a future contributor to our society versus somebody who's coming here with an ulterior motive. And we really need to have the government help with that screening process rather than to try to take it inside the universities.
But I mean, some of us think, yes, in agreement, that it should be more an administrative role of the agencies with the universities and not criminalizing, sometimes by total mistake. I mean, just errors get made and they destroy people's lives and careers. I guess one would hope that wise policy will prevail, but it's probably incumbent on all of us to make sure wise policy prevails. Norm, did you want to add a comment on that issue?
Well, I just think it's important to distinguish between truly basic fundamental research on the one hand and applied research, development, production on the other hand. And the tradition in this country and in most other countries over the years in basic research has been to publish your results, share them, and then get the benefits of the kind of feedback that John talked about earlier, that in this case comes from abroad. And so many of the things that we point to with pride have their roots in various different places, some in this country, some not. And so I think with basic research, with the exception of those very few things that are clearly heavily military related, atomic bomb would be an example. With the exception of those, I think we hurt ourselves more by building a wall around ourselves than we do by letting the occasional bad actor in. And so the solution, and I think this sort of parallels what John said, is that our government keeps U.S. citizens from getting in our universities and committing crimes based on what they learned. Or it tries to, if you come into our universities' labs with the idea of doing harm somehow, our government takes care of that. And it should do the same thing with foreign people. There are plenty of examples of people from China, students coming here and breaking the rules. And it's hard to ask the university to enforce that. They can, when they see signs of it, they can report it. But I think that it really depends heavily on the government to control the behavior in that sense of anybody who comes here who wants to do us harm.
Well, and we have in place, I think, with the federal agencies, I'm more familiar with National Science Foundation, we have an Office Inspector General who has the authority to keep a watch out for any kind of violation of the agency's regulations or the law, and they may or may not pass things along to the Justice Department. I mean, it's not perfect. Let me not be the first to sing the praise of the Inspector General, I assure you, but still provided a very important function. And I would think the mechanism is there. John, let me take you back not too far to your presidency. I think you served in 2016 until 2016, 16 years. I mean, you look really good.
That's because I got out before COVID.
Yeah, but you had a recession in the middle of it.
I did have a recession.
A hard time. But the question I want to ask, because I think your campus, part of that transformative period where you served as at the helm, you did some extraordinary things with underrepresented groups, minorities. I mean, that's obviously a huge challenge because we need the domestic population. We need more, and we need to change that 78th number on Norm's slide. Need to bring more young people into science and engineering. It's the fair thing to do, but it's also so critically important to the country. How did you do what you did? Were there lessons learned? Are there things the government should be doing? Or does every university just have to do this on its own?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I think as Norm clearly pointed out, our long-term challenge is to fix our K-12 program across the country. It is one of the sources of inequality in our country. We do not offer a high-quality education to lots of young people, and hence we see underrepresentation in many fields. I think we worked hard to try to extend it and to make people feel like they belonged in science and engineering majors. And that they could be successful. We also built bridges, which I think our universities are going to have to do. If we sit back and say, we're going to wait till K-12 gets fixed, we're going to have a very long wait to get K-12 fixed and equitable across the country. So the universities are going to have to build bridges that help students from less well-resourced schools that didn't have the opportunity to take calculus as an AP course to really do that work so that they can participate in the advantages of science and engineering majors.
Thank you. I got a clarification on the issue that we talked about earlier about the difference between basic research and research reported by industry. And one of our colleagues suggests the tax code actually requires that companies who to report long-term product development as basic research. There may be some significant definitional differences here that sort of answers my more naive question. So question about education then, and we've been worried about STEM education from pre-K, 12, even undergraduate education, because so often students come in without adequate preparation. So that's shifted, especially in the public universities, it's shifted the curriculum necessarily to accommodate for that. What indeed do we do? I mean, K-12 is a local and politically fraught territory. I mean, is there some hope here? I know Norm's Rising Above the Gathering Storm report had a number of specific recommendations, Norm, which you could point to, but I raised the question for both of you. Norm, you could start, and then if John has a view here.
Well, the first challenge in quote fixing unquote our public school system is that we have 14,000 public school districts, and if we fix them one at a time, like John points out, it's going to take quite a while. And there are several things that can be done. One of them, I've spent a lot of time in recent years on this topic, and one of them that comes to my mind as being very important is the preschool preparation. So many children in our country arrive at first grade or kindergarten 3 years behind, and quite literally. And they don't ever have a chance to catch up. They're lost before they begin. And so somehow we need to give every child an opportunity to begin first grade on an even level and a chance to succeed. That's one observation that I would make. Another is that while I am a strong proponent of higher education, it changed my life. And I didn't have nearly as much of it as either of you did, but it did change my life. And it's my belief that even given that our system is too much focused on one path, that your K through 12 system is sort of aimed at going off to college. It would seem to me that there are fine jobs that are very respectable jobs that don't require a college education. There are young people who don't care to go to college, or maybe can't afford to go to college, or are qualified, that could go to a school and learn, get an apprenticeship, learn a trade, be proud of it, and have a very fine life. So I think that's another factor that comes to my mind. And I could go on, but I'll stop. John, you may want to pick up.
I'll just make one point, which I think is a really critical insight in thinking about it, and gets back to your first recommendation, Norm. If you take those PISA scores and you sort them by economic classifications, or looking at whether a child comes from a less well-off or a better well-off family, the US doesn't do poorly for the upper half of its population. It does terribly for the lower half of its population, and the lower quartile in particular. And that gets back to Norm's recommendation. We should have free preschooling available for all children, so that they have that opportunity to get that jump start, and they don't begin walking in at several grade levels behind. And I think that's one of the most critical things we could do to improve the quality and the equality of our system.
Thank you. So I've gotten a question here, taking us back to this issue of the response of the U.S. government, and maybe even some of our universities and agencies, to the perceived threat from Chinese students coming in. And I know that some of our departments are experiencing this in real time. I mean, I don't want to talk politically here along partisan lines, but just say even today, in some of our universities are having graduate students coming in from China are having difficulties getting visas. I see you nod, John. Are you finding that at Stanford as well?
We did have some problems. We actually have seen that several times. We saw it after 9/11 as well. We had a problem, but we were able to get people to intercede then. It was a more difficult problem this time around. I think we've largely solved it. I'm on the same page as Norm here. You should have a system which screens out people who you know might be real threats, but doesn't encumber the vast majority of our students who come to the United States to take advantage of a world-class education system and make contributions to our technology as well.
Let me ask, take us back to an issue we talked about before. In terms of federal policy, this does feel like a different time to me. I mean, the Schumer-Young Bipartisan Endless Frontier Act is unlike any legislation I can imagine, or I remember, but I'm almost would want to say I would never have anticipated something quite that bold. And there are many other bills, some of them partisan, some not, pointing in the same direction. And then, of course, President Biden through the campaign, and today, of course, he's talking about his infrastructure planning. These are very bold ideas in terms of federal spending, but also other ways in which the federal government would get involved in the work of industry and job creation, and well, at least job training and other ways. Is this a different time? I mean, is this really an inflection point? Is it a hiccup? I mean, how do you feel about what's going on right now? Norm, let me start with you.
Well, we all remember the doubling of the NIH budget that disappeared after a while, and there are other examples. But I do have a feeling that there's an awakening here. And I think back about 25 years ago when I was still out in the industry, I wrote an op-ed on the importance of university-based research. And I asked 25 CEOs of Fortune 100 companies if they would put their signature below it with mine, and we'd publish it. And 24 of the 25 agreed to do it. And I thought, gosh, this maybe will have an impact. It's amazing to get those people to agree on anything. And we took it to the better known media outlets, and the reaction of the media was that we don't want to publish that. That's not of interest to our readers. Nobody was interested in that. And so finally, we took money out of our pockets and published it ourselves as an advertorial. And but that reaction was at that time that basic research science, I mean, it sort of grows on trees. And I think that's changed. And the key is to keep the momentum and face the elephant in the living room.
So thank you for that. I have a very different kind of question about free tuition. So is that a good idea for public universities and community colleges and other such educational organizations?
I think community college tuition should be free. It is in many parts of the country are so close to it. I think it should be free. And I think we should be thinking about how to use our community colleges the way Norm pointed out. Europe does a much better job of creating opportunities for people who get a 2-year professional degree after they go to high school and then go out and work in highly paid jobs as medical technicians, as people doing complex work, and earn good salaries. And I think we need to think about how to more effectively use our system to do that kind of education.
Norm, have a comment?
No, I just think that's exactly right. That there are so many opportunities there. One thing I would do, if I take a second to go back to the questions about how do we improve our school system, but there's a third element that I didn't mention, and that was that we don't have an adequate number of teachers who can teach STEM. The majority of our kids in middle school have a physical science teacher who, if they have one at all, who doesn't have a degree in the physical sciences. And one of the proposals of the Gathering Storm report was that the federal government fund every year 100,000 competitively awarded scholarships to students to study science and technology, U.S. students to study science and technology at a U.S. university, and in exchange for that, spend 5 years teaching, at least 5 years, teaching in a public school and teaching math and science. And some of those ideas, I think, have a lot of promise.
Thank you. Well, we're getting very close to the end. Let me just ask each of you if you've got a 1-minute takeaway message to share before we have to close off. John, start with you.
You know, I think if I were to tell everyone a message, I'd say we are in a competitive situation unlike any we've ever seen before. Some of us are old enough to remember when we were worried about Japan taking over so many of our industries and how we countered that and what happened. This situation is remarkably different and will be much harder to solve. And I think we have to be serious about making the long-term investments if we're going to maintain both our economic security as well as our national security.
Thank you. Norm?
I just go back to my opening remarks that our nation and our well-being and the quality of lives of our citizens is heavily dependent upon having a strong economy. And having a strong economy is heavily dependent upon science and technology. And in the area of science and technology, we're currently on the path to lose the race to the Chinese very quickly. And we have the wherewithal to do something about it. I would just observe that politicians like to blame China for our problems. But if you think of the problems we've talked about, it isn't China that decides what we do with our public schools. It isn't China that decides who we'll let come into our country to study. And it isn't China. You go down the list of the things we've talked about, it's us. And if anybody's going to solve it, as Pogo the Possum said, we've met the enemy and he's weak. For us, I guess he said.
Thank you both. I wish we had another hour, but we don't. I want to thank Norm Augustine, John Hennessy, for joining us today to share your insights and your experience. I also want to thank the audience for your attention and questions, and invite all of you to attend as many virtual events being hosted by the Baker Institute as you can, and we hope to see you in person as soon as we're able to do that. You can find more information of all these events on the Baker Institute website, which you can find online. Let me just say, we didn't get to all the questions. I'm sorry, we had a lot of interest, but we'll make sure the questions are made available to our speakers so they know what's on your minds, and there are certainly some good ideas there they would want to know about. So until next time, hope everybody is staying safe, healthy, sane, and thank you all for joining us today.